So, are you all comfortable, ready for another chapter? I hope you weren't too discouraged after the last chapter. It was pretty sad, wasn't it? But remember I told you it's not the end of the book and it's going to get better? Okay, we're on going to start chapter 15 now of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And after this, there'll be 2 more chapters. Today, 15, then 16 and 17. That'll be that for this book. And we'll have to get into the next book. Okay, so it was pretty sad ending. And we don't know exactly how it's going to turn out, but I promise it's going to be better. Okay? Chapter 15, Deeper Magic from Before the Dawn of Time. While the 2 girls still crouched in the bushes with their hands over their faces, they heard the voice of the witch calling out, "Now, follow me all, and we will set about what remains of this war. It will not take us long to crush the human vermin and the traitors now that the great fool, the great cat, lies dead." Now at this moment, the children were for a few seconds in very great danger. For with wild cries and a noise of skirling pipes and shrill horns blowing, the whole of that vile rabble, that mob, came sweeping off the hilltop and down the slope right past their hiding place. They felt the specters go by them like a cold wind, and they felt the ground shake beneath them under the galloping feet of the minotaurs. And overhead there went a flurry of foul wings and a blackness of vultures and giant bats. At any other time they would have trembled with fear, but right now the sadness and the shame and the horror of Aslan's death so filled their minds that they hardly even thought about it. As soon as the woods were silent again, Susan and Lucy crept out onto the open hilltop. The moon was getting low and thin clouds were passing across her, but still they could see the shape of the lion lying dead in his bonds. And down they both knelt in the wet grass and kissed his cold face and stroked his beautiful fur, what was left of it anyway, and they cried till they could cry no more. And when they looked at each other and held each other's hands for mere loneliness, they cried again, and then again, until they were at last silent. Finally, Lucy said, I can't bear to look at that horrible muzzle. I wonder, could we take it off?" So they tried, and after a lot of working at it, for their fingers were cold, and it was now the darkest part of the night, they finally succeeded. And when they saw his face without the muzzle on it, they burst out crying again. And they kissed it and fondled it and wiped away the blood and the foam as well as they could. And it was all more lonely and hopeless and horrid than I even know how to describe. I wonder, could we untie him as well?" said Susan. But the enemies, out of pure spitefulness, had pulled the cords and the ropes so tight that the girls could make nothing of the knots. I hope no one who reads this book has been quite as miserable as Susan and Lucy were that night. But if you have been, if you've been up all night and, well, if you've cried till you have no more tears left in you, you will know that there comes in the end a sort of quietness. You might feel as if nothing was ever going to happen again. At any rate, that's how it felt to these 2. Hours and hours seemed to go by in this dead calm. And they hardly noticed that they were getting colder and colder. But at last Lucy noted 2 other things. One was that the sky on the east side of the hill was a little less dark than it had been an hour ago. The other thing was that some tiny movement was going on in the grass at her feet. At first she took no interest in this. What did it matter anyway? Nothing mattered now. But at last she saw that whatever it was had begun to move up the upright stones of the stone table. And now whatever they were moving about on Aslan's body. She looked closer. They were little gray things. "Ah," said Susan from the other side of the table. "How beastly! There's horrid little mice crawling over him. Go away, you little beasts!" And she raised her hand to frighten them away. "Wait," said Lucy, who had been looking at them more closely still. "Can you see what they're doing?" Both girls bent down and stared. "I do believe," said Susan, "but how strange. They're chewing away at the ropes." That's what I thought, said Lucy. I think they're friendly mice. Poor little things, they don't realize he's dead. They think it'll do some good untying him. And it was quite definitely getting lighter by now, and each of the girls noticed for the first time the white face of each other. They could now see the mice nibbling away, dozens and dozens, maybe even hundreds of little field mice. And at last, one by one, the ropes were all chewed through. The sky in the east was quite whitish by now, and the stars were getting fainter, all except one very big star laying low down on the eastern horizon. They felt colder than they had been all night. The mice crept away again. The girls got up and cleared away the remains of the gnawed ropes. Aslan now looked even more like himself without the ropes on him. Every moment his dead face looked nobler as the light grew and they could see it better. In the woods behind them, a bird gave a chuckling sound. And it had been so still and so quiet for hours and hours that even this little bird noise startled them. Then another bird answered it. Soon there were birds singing all over the place. It was quite definitely early morning now, not late night anymore. I am so cold, said Lucy. So am I, said Susan. Let's walk around a little bit. So they walked to the eastern edge of the hill and they looked down. The one big star had almost disappeared by now. The country all looked dark and gray, but beyond, at the very end of the world, the sea showed pale, and the sky began to turn red. They walked back and forth more times than they could count between the dead Aslan and the eastern ridge, trying to keep moving and keep warm. And oh, how tired their legs started to feel then. At last, as they stood for a moment looking out towards the sea in Cair Paravel, which they could now just make out down below, the red sky turned to gold along the very line where the sea and the sky met, and very slowly up came the edge of the sun. The second at that moment they heard from behind them a great loud noise, a cracking, deafening noise, as if a giant had broken a giant plate. What was that? Said Lucy, clutching Susan's arm. I'm afraid to turn around, said Susan. Something awful is happening. They're doing something worse to him, said Lucy. Come on. And she turned, pulling Lucy around with her. The rising of the sun had made everything look so different when they turned around. All the colors and the shadows were changed that for a moment they didn't even see the important thing. And then they did. The stone table was broken into two pieces by a great crack that ran down it from one end to the other. And there was no Aslan. Oh, it's too bad. Oh, said the girls, rushing to the table. Why didn't they just leave his body alone at least? Who has done it? Cried Susan. What does it mean? Is this more magic? Yes, said a great voice behind their backs. It is more magic. They looked around. There, shining in the sunrise, larger than they'd ever seen him before, shaking his mane, for apparently it had grown back again, stood Aslan himself. Oh, Aslan, cried the children, staring up at him, almost as much frightened as they were glad. Aren't you dead then, dear Aslan? Said Lucy. Not now, said Aslan. Well, you're not, asked Susan in a shaky voice. She couldn't quite bring herself to say the word ghost, but she wanted to know what was going on. Aslan stooped his golden head and licked her forehead. The warmth of his breath and a rich sort of smell that seemed to hang about his hair came all over her. Do I look like I'm dead? He said. Oh, you're real. You're real. Oh, Aslan, cried Lucy, and both girls flung themselves upon him and covered him with kisses. But what does it all mean? Asked Susan when they were somewhat calmer. Well, it means, said Aslan, that although the witch knew the deep magic, there is a magic deeper still which she did not know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time. But if she could have looked a little further back into the stillness and the darkness before time dawned, she would have read there a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack, and death itself would start working backwards. And now, "Oh, yes, now," said Lucy, jumping up and clapping her hands. "Oh, children," said the lion, "I feel my strength coming back to me. Oh, children, catch me if you can." He stood for a moment, his eyes very bright and twinkling. His limbs were quivering, lashing himself with his tail. Then he made a high leap over top of their heads and landed on the other side of the table. Laughing, though she didn't know why, Lucy scrambled over the table to reach him, and Aslan leaped again, and a mad chase began. Round and round the hilltop he led them, now hopelessly out of their reach, now letting them almost catch his tail, now diving between them, now tossing them in the air with his huge and beautifully velveted paws, and catching them again, and now stopping unexpectedly so that all three of them rolled together over and over in a happy, leaping heap of fur and arms and legs. It was such a romp as no one has ever had except in Narnia. And whether it was more like playing with a thunderstorm or playing with a kitten, Lucy could never quite make her mind. And you know how after you play that hard for so long, how tired and hungry and thirsty you can be? Well, the funny thing was that when all three of them finally lay together panting in the sun, the girls no longer felt in the least bit tired or hungry or thirsty. "And now," said Aslan presently, "to business. I feel I am going to roar. You had better put your fingers in your ears." And they did. And Aslan stood up, and when he opened his mouth to roar, his face became so terrible and powerful that they didn't dare look at it. And they saw all the trees in front of him bend before the blast of this roaring, as the grass bends in a meadow before the wind. And then he said, "We have a long journey to go. You must ride on me." And he crouched down, and the children climbed onto his warm, golden back. Susan sat first, holding on tightly to his mane, and Lucy sat behind him, holding on tightly to Susan. And with a great heave, he rose underneath them, then shot off, faster than any horse could go, down the hill and into the thick of the forest. That ride was perhaps the most wonderful thing that happened to them in Narnia. Have you ever had a gallop on a horse? Some of you have, haven't you? Well, think of that, and then take away the heavy noise of the hoofs, and the jingling of the bits and the reins, and imagine instead the almost noiseless padding of the great big paws. Then imagine, instead of the black or gray or chestnut back of a horse that you're sitting on, imagine the soft roughness of golden fur, and the mane flying back in the wind. And then imagine you are going about twice as fast as the fastest racehorse. But this is a mount that doesn't need to be guided, doesn't need reins, and it never grows tired. He rushed on and on, never missing his footing, never hesitating, threading his way with perfect skill between tree trunks, jumping over bushes and briars and smaller streams, wading the larger streams and swimming the biggest of them all. And you're riding, not on a road, nor in a park, not even in a field, but right across Narnia in spring, down solemn avenues of beech trees and across sunny glades of oak trees, through wild orchards of snow-white cherry trees, past roaring waterfalls and mossy rocks and echoing caverns, up windy slopes that are alight with gorse bushes, and across the shoulders of heathery mountains and along giddy ridges, and down, then down, down again into the wild valleys and out into acres of blue flowers. And they went on and on. It was nearly midday at this rocketing speed when they found themselves looking down a steep hillside at a castle. It looked like a little toy castle from where they stood, which seemed to be all pointed towers and just a little thing, but as the lion rushed down at such a speed, it grew larger every moment. Before they had time to even ask themselves what it was, they were already on a level with it. And now it took longer, it no longer looked like a toy castle, but it rose frowning in front of them. No faces looked over the battlements, and the gates were shut tight. And Aslan, not at all slowing his pace, he just rushed straight towards it as a bullet. "The witch is home," he cried. "Now, children, hold tight." Next moment, the whole world seemed to turn upside down, and the children felt as if they had left their insides behind them, for the lion had gathered himself for a greater leap than any he had yet made, and he jumped, or you might call it flying almost, but he jumped right over the castle wall. The two girls, breathless but unhurt, found themselves tumbling off his back when he landed in the middle of a wide stone courtyard full of statues. So, did I tell you it was going to get better? That's the end of chapter 15. And there are 2 chapters left. Chapter 16, which is called What Happened About the Statues. And after that, there'll only be one more. Okay, come back tomorrow. We're going to see what happens.